The Cambridge spy ring emerged from a specific convergence of social privilege, ideological conviction, and institutional vulnerability in Britain during the interwar years. But its most consequential effects unfolded during the Cold War, when the men involved occupied positions that allowed them to influence, obstruct, and sometimes neutralize Western intelligence operations at precisely the moment when Anglo-American cooperation became central to containing Soviet power. And to understand the operational damage inflicted after 1945, it is necessary to trace how British intelligence culture entered the Cold War with assumptions shaped by class trust, rather than systematic counterintelligence rigor, assumptions that allowed a small number of well-placed officers to operate for years without meaningful scrutiny, even as they transmitted sensitive material to Moscow. And by the late 1940s, this structural weakness had become embedded within MI6 itself, whose senior ranks were dominated by men drawn from the same social networks that had produced the spies, reinforcing an environment in which loyalty was inferred from background and demeanor rather than verified through security discipline. And it was within this environment that Kim Philby, already a seasoned Soviet agent by the time of the Second World War, rose steadily through the post-war intelligence hierarchy, eventually becoming head of MI6's Section 9, the department responsible for countering Soviet intelligence, a position that placed him at the center of Britain's Cold War intelligence posture and granted him access to virtually every sensitive operation directed against the Soviet Union, including liaison material from the United States, assessments of Soviet intentions, and details of clandestine networks across Europe. And this concentration of access proved catastrophic, because Philby was not merely collecting documents, but actively shaping the flow of information, determining which warnings were emphasized, which suspicions were dismissed, and which operations were quietly exposed to Soviet counterintelligence before they could mature. And in doing so, he transformed espionage from a passive act of reporting into an active instrument of strategic denial, ensuring that Western intelligence repeatedly encountered inexplicable failures that were attributed to chance, poor tradecraft, or Soviet efficiency rather than internal compromise. And as the Cold War intensified in the late 1940s, the operational consequences of this penetration became increasingly severe, particularly in Eastern Europe, where British and American services attempted to establish stay-behind networks, exfiltrate defectors, and support resistance groups in territories that had fallen under Soviet control. Operations that were systematically rolled up by local security services with a speed and precision that suggested foreknowledge. Yet even as these failures accumulated, internal doubts within MI6 were muted by the belief that such penetrations were inevitable in hostile environments, and by a reluctance to question colleagues whose social standing rendered suspicion uncomfortable. And this reluctance was reinforced by institutional memory from the Second World War, when informal networks and personal judgment had often substituted for formal procedure under emergency conditions, a legacy that proved dangerously ill-suited to the protracted and ideologically charged struggle of the Cold War. And while Philby represented the most damaging node in this network, he was not alone, because Donald Maclean and Guy Burgess, operating primarily within the Foreign Office and diplomatic postings, ensured that Soviet intelligence received a continuous stream of high-level political and strategic reporting during the early Cold War years, including details of Anglo-American atomic policy discussions, NATO planning assumptions, and assessments of Soviet capabilities, material that allowed Moscow to calibrate its diplomacy and military posture with a level of insight far exceeding what Western leaders believed possible. And this intelligence advantage fed back into MI6 operations through subtle channels, as Soviet responses appeared measured and anticipatory, reinforcing Western assumptions about Soviet caution rather than alerting them to the presence of a leak, and the operational damage was compounded by the nature of Anglo-American intelligence cooperation, which intensified rapidly after 1945, but rested heavily on trust, meaning that information shared by the CIA with MI6 was often passed onward to Moscow without American knowledge, creating a structural asymmetry in which the United States exposed sensitive sources and methods while remaining unaware that its closest partner was compromised at senior levels. And this imbalance persisted through the late 1940s and early 1950s, shaping the early Cold War intelligence environment in ways that distorted Western threat, perception, and undermined confidence in human intelligence as a viable tool against the Soviet bloc. And when suspicions finally began to surface, triggered by Soviet defections and fragmentary counterintelligence reporting, they encountered fierce institutional resistance, because acknowledging penetration at the highest levels of MI6 would have required a public reckoning with class assumptions, recruitment practices, and the limits of gentlemanly trust. A reckoning for which neither the intelligence leadership nor the political establishment was prepared, and thus early warnings were downplayed, investigations narrowed, and damaging conclusions deferred, allowing Philby to remain in position long enough to observe and betray some of the most sensitive Western intelligence initiatives of the early Cold War, including assessments of Soviet internal stability after Stalin's death, and early Western efforts to exploit perceived openings within the Eastern Bloc. And by the time Burgess and McLean defected to Moscow in 1951, triggering public scandal and forcing MI6 to confront the reality of internal betrayal, the operational damage had already been done. Because Philby's survival and continued acceptance within the service allowed Soviet intelligence to retain a privileged window into Western counterintelligence thinking during a critical period, and even after Philby was forced to resign from MI6 under suspicion, his informal rehabilitation as a journalist and continued contact with intelligence circles reflected the persistence of the same cultural blind spots that had enabled his rise, ensuring that the full scope of the Cambridge spy ring's operational impact remained obscured well into the Cold War, shaping Western intelligence failures in ways that were often recognized only in retrospect, when declassified material revealed how deeply Soviet intelligence had penetrated the very structures designed to oppose it. The exposure of Burgess and McLean in 1951 marked a visible rupture in British intelligence credibility, but operationally it represented only a partial unmasking of a far deeper penetration that continued to distort Cold War intelligence long after the immediate scandal faded. Because while the defections forced MI6 to confront the existence of a spy ring, they did not compel it to fully accept the extent to which that ring had shaped outcomes across multiple theaters, and this reluctance had direct consequences for ongoing operations, particularly as Western intelligence attempted to regroup and adapt to a rapidly hardening division of Europe. And in the aftermath of the defections, British and American services initiated reviews of compromised material and exposed networks. Yet these efforts were constrained by uncertainty over what had been passed to Moscow and when, a problem compounded by the fact that Philby, the most operationally damaging member of the ring, remained at liberty and continued to influence intelligence discourse indirectly through his relationships and reputation. And this ambiguity created a lingering paralysis within MI6, where officers were forced to plan operations under the assumption that Soviet counterintelligence might already be aware of them, undermining confidence in human intelligence initiatives and encouraging an over-reliance on technical collection and diplomatic reporting, a shift that altered the balance of Western intelligence capabilities during a period when insight into Soviet internal dynamics was particularly scarce, and the operational fallout was most visible in Eastern Europe, where Western-sponsored resistance and exfiltration efforts had already suffered heavy losses during the late 1940s. Losses that could now be reinterpreted as the result of systematic betrayal rather than isolated failures of tradecraft. Yet this reinterpretation was slow to take hold, because acknowledging it would have required a retrospective admission that entire campaigns had been compromised from inception, an admission that threatened institutional legitimacy and personal reputations. And as a result, the narrative that emerged within MI6 emphasized lessons learned and procedural reform rather than accountability for past decisions, allowing the deeper structural causes of the penetration to persist beneath a veneer of change. And these structural causes were rooted not only in recruitment practices, but in an organizational culture that equated discretion with loyalty and treated ideological motivation as a peripheral concern. A culture that proved ill-equipped to detect agents driven by long-term conviction rather than short-term inducement. And this blind spot was particularly dangerous in the early Cold War, when ideological alignment had become a central axis of global conflict, and Soviet intelligence actively sought recruits who could operate patiently within elite institutions without attracting suspicion. And the Cambridge spy ring exemplified this approach, because its members were not outsiders seeking access, but insiders whose backgrounds conferred automatic trust, allowing them to bypass scrutiny and occupy roles where they could influence policy and operations over extended periods. And the operational impact of this influence extended beyond specific betrayals to the shaping of Western intelligence priorities themselves, because by filtering information and downplaying certain threats, Philby and his associates contributed to an intelligence environment in which Soviet capabilities appeared opaque yet stable, discouraging aggressive countermeasures and reinforcing a cautious Western posture that aligned unintentionally with Soviet strategic interests during the early phases of nuclear deterrence. And this effect was amplified by the asymmetry of intelligence sharing within the Anglo-American alliance, as American services, particularly the CIA, relied heavily on British expertise and networks in Europe. During their formative years, exposing sensitive sources and methods to compromise without reciprocal visibility into British internal security vulnerabilities, and when American suspicions began to emerge, they were often tempered by diplomatic considerations and by deference to British assurances, illustrating how alliance politics can inhibit counterintelligence rigor, even when evidence warrants confrontation. And this inhibition had tangible operational consequences, delaying the full reassessment of joint programs and prolonging exposure to compromise. And within MI6, the post-1951 period was thus characterized by a tension between reform and denial, as new security procedures were introduced alongside informal efforts to protect the institution's reputation, resulting in a hybrid system that improved vetting at junior levels while leaving senior culture largely intact. And it was within this environment that Philby managed to evade decisive action, benefiting from ambiguity, professional courtesy, and the absence of incontrovertible proof, all of which reflected a deeper reluctance to accept that ideological betrayal could coexist with outward conformity. And this reluctance had the effect of extending the operational damage inflicted by the Cambridge spy ring into the mid-1950s, as Soviet intelligence continued to benefit from insights into Western counterintelligence thinking, and from the residual caution that permeated MI6 planning, reducing the effectiveness of new initiatives before they could be fully tested. And as the Cold War entered a new phase following Stalin's death in 1953, the persistence of these distortions complicated Western efforts to assess Soviet intentions during a period of apparent transition, reinforcing conservative interpretations and limiting the scope of exploratory engagement. And although it would be misleading to attribute broader strategic outcomes solely to the actions of the Cambridge spies, their penetration undeniably shaped the informational environment within which decisions were made, constraining options and reinforcing uncertainty at critical junctures. And by the time Philby's role was finally confronted more directly later in the decade, the opportunity to fully account for the early Cold War's intelligence failures had largely passed, leaving historians to reconstruct a fragmented record in which the operational consequences of betrayal must be inferred from patterns of failure, hesitation, and misinterpretation rather than from explicit admissions. And this fragmentation itself is part of the Ring's legacy because it reflects how deeply the spies succeeded in embedding themselves within institutional processes, ensuring that even their exposure could not fully disentangle their influence from the intelligence history they helped to shape. By the mid-1950s, the unresolved status of Philby within the British intelligence system had become a strategic liability rather than a mere embarrassment, because his continued proximity to intelligence circles, even after his formal resignation from MI6, ensured that Soviet intelligence retained insight into Western thinking at a time when Cold War operations were undergoing significant adaptation. And this persistence revealed how incomplete the institutional response to the Cambridge spy ring had been. As reforms introduced in the wake of the Burgess and McLean defections focused heavily on procedural tightening, rather than on confronting the deeper cultural assumptions that had enabled long-term penetration. And this imbalance had operational consequences that extended beyond Britain, shaping the behavior of Allied services that increasingly questioned the reliability of intelligence shared through British channels while remaining constrained by political necessity from openly severing cooperation. And within the CIA, this tension manifested as a growing internal debate over the extent to which British liaison material could be trusted, particularly on issues relating to Soviet counterintelligence capabilities and internal stability, areas where Philby's influence had been most pronounced. And although these doubts were rarely formalized in policy, they influenced operational planning in subtle ways, encouraging compartmentation and selective sharing that complicated joint initiatives and slowed decision-making during a period when speed and coordination were considered essential to countering perceived Soviet advances. And this erosion of trust was mirrored within MI6 itself, where officers tasked with rebuilding operational capacity faced the paradox of needing to restore confidence without fully acknowledging the scope of prior compromise. A challenge that led to cautious incremental reforms rather than decisive structural overhaul. And as a result, the service entered the late 1950s with improved security procedures, but lingering uncertainty about its own analytical foundations, and a uncertainty rooted in the recognition that for years its assessments had been shaped by individuals whose loyalties lay elsewhere. And this recognition weighed heavily on efforts to re-establish human intelligence networks in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, where previous failures could no longer be attributed solely to hostile conditions, but had to be reconsidered in light of internal betrayal, discouraging ambitious initiatives, and reinforcing a preference for lower risk, lower yield collection methods. And this strategic conservatism aligned with broader Western trends toward technical intelligence, including signals interception and, increasingly, overhead reconnaissance, shifts that reduced reliance on deeply penetrated human sources, but also narrowed the scope of insight into political intent and internal dynamics, leaving policymakers with a more mechanistic understanding of Soviet power that emphasized capabilities over motivations. And this narrowing can be traced in part to the damage inflicted by the Cambridge spy ring, which undermined confidence in the very category of intelligence most capable of illuminating intentions. And as Philby's situation evolved, with mounting evidence and renewed scrutiny, driven by defections and fragmentary revelations from Soviet sources. MI6 faced a prolonged dilemma over how aggressively to pursue the case against him, balancing the risk of public scandal against the operational necessity of closure. And this hesitation again reflected the enduring influence of class-based trust and institutional self-protection, as senior figures resisted conclusions that would indict not only an individual, but an entire system of recruitment and advancement. And when Philby was eventually confronted more directly, the protracted nature of the process underscored how deeply ingrained these resistances were, allowing him time to assess the threat and ultimately to defect to the Soviet Union in 1963, an outcome that confirmed the worst fears of Western counterintelligence, but arrived too late to mitigate the damage already done. And Philby's defection forced a final reckoning that stripped away remaining illusions about the depth of Soviet penetration, prompting a more candid reassessment of Cold War intelligence history within Britain and among its allies. Yet even this reckoning was constrained by the need to protect sources, methods, and diplomatic relationships, ensuring that much of the operational damage would only be acknowledged decades later through declassification and scholarly reconstruction. And in operational terms, the belated exposure of Philby closed a chapter that had begun before the Cold War, but cast a long shadow over its formative years, revealing how early assumptions about loyalty and threat had shaped the intelligence environment in which subsequent crises unfolded. And although by the 1960s, Western intelligence services had adapted to a more disciplined and skeptical posture, the legacy of the Cambridge spy ring continued to influence attitudes toward counterintelligence, alliance trust, and the management of ideological risk, reinforcing a belief that penetration at the highest levels was not an aberration, but a structural possibility that demanded constant vigilance. And this belief became embedded in training, doctrine, and organizational memory, shaping how intelligence professionals approached recruitment, vetting, and operational security long after the immediate actors had disappeared from the scene. And for historians, the mid-1950s thus represent a critical inflection point in the ring's operational impact, marking the transition from active penetration to lingering distortion, as the effects of betrayal persisted not through continued access, but through the caution, suspicion, and recalibration it imposed on Western intelligence practice, a transition that illustrates how the consequences of espionage can outlast the spies themselves, shaping institutional behavior and strategic perception across decades of rivalry and reinforcing the central lesson of the Cambridge spy ring's Cold War legacy, that the most damaging effects of betrayal are often indirect, unfolding slowly through altered assumptions and constrained choices, rather than through immediate and visible catastrophe. The final operational phase of the Cambridge spy ring's impact unfolded not through further penetrations, but through the process by which Western intelligence attempted to absorb, interpret, and neutralize the damage already inflicted, a process that revealed how deeply espionage can shape institutions even after exposure. Because by the early 1960s, the knowledge that Soviet intelligence had enjoyed sustained access to British and Allied decision-making during the Cold War's formative years forced a reconsideration of past assessments that extended beyond individual operations to the broader strategic narrative that had guided policy. And within MI6, this reconsideration took place under the dual pressures of public accountability and classified necessity, as officials sought to demonstrate reform without fully disclosing the extent to which prior judgments had been compromised. A balancing act that influenced how lessons were framed and which failures were emphasized or quietly set aside. And in operational terms, this meant that the service focused on reinforcing counterintelligence mechanisms, tightening access controls and professionalizing vetting procedures, while leaving largely unexamined the informal networks of influence and social cohesion that had enabled the original penetration, ensuring that some of the deeper vulnerabilities remained latent rather than eliminated. And this partial reckoning shaped MI6's approach to Cold War operations during the 1960s, encouraging a cautious posture that favored incremental gains and avoided initiatives that might invite scrutiny or risk further embarrassment. Posture that aligned with the broader Western emphasis on stability and crisis management during an era defined by nuclear deterrence. And among Allied services, the exposure of Philby and the retrospective understanding of his role reinforced a more guarded approach to intelligence sharing, as the assumption of automatic trust between partners gave way to a more transactional model in which information was compartmented and selectively exchanged based on assessed risk rather than institutional loyalty, a shift that improved resilience against single-point failures, but also introduced friction into alliance coordination, particularly during fast-moving crises where delays and miscommunication could carry serious consequences. And this evolution underscores how espionage can reshape not only the internal practices of an intelligence service, but the architecture of alliances themselves, altering patterns of cooperation in ways that persist long after the original breach has been addressed. And as the Cold War continued into later decades, the Cambridge spy ring receded into historical memory, even as its lessons remained embedded in professional culture, influencing how intelligence officers were trained to think about ideological motivation, long-term deception, and the limits of background-based trust, lessons that proved relevant as new adversaries and new forms of infiltration emerged in different geopolitical contexts. And from a historical perspective, the operational significance of the ring lies not in any single document passed to Moscow or operation betrayed in the field, but in the cumulative effect of sustained distortion. Because by shaping what Western intelligence believed it knew and what it considered unknowable, the spies influenced the boundaries of policy debate during a critical period when assumptions about Soviet intent and stability were still being formed. And this influence was subtle, manifesting in patterns of caution, misattribution, and analytical conservatism that are difficult to quantify but evident in the record of early Cold War intelligence failures and hesitations. And the challenge for historians has been to reconstruct these patterns without succumbing to retrospective determinism, recognizing that while the Cambridge spy ring did not single-handedly dictate Cold War outcomes, it materially affected the informational environment in which choices were made, an environment already burdened by uncertainty, fear, and the unprecedented stakes of nuclear confrontation. And in this context, the ring serves as a case study in how intelligence penetration can amplify existing biases and structural weaknesses rather than creating them anew, exploiting assumptions about loyalty and identity that were already present and turning them into instruments of strategic advantage. And as declassification has gradually illuminated the full scope of the ring's activities, it has become clear that its Cold War legacy is best understood as a process rather than an event, unfolding across decades through altered practices, strained alliances, and a persistent wariness toward human intelligence that reshaped Western intelligence doctrine. And in this sense, the Cambridge spy ring occupies a central place in Cold War history, not because it delivered decisive victories to one side, but because it revealed the fragility of the systems designed to manage rivalry without war. Systems that depended on trust, discretion, and judgment in a world where ideological commitment could override every outward marker of reliability. And by exposing these fragilities, the ring forced a painful but necessary evolution in intelligence practice, an evolution that continued long after the principal actors had disappeared from view, and the Cold War itself had entered its final phase, leaving behind a legacy defined less by betrayal alone than by the enduring transformation of how intelligence services understood risk, loyalty, and the limits of certainty in a divided world. As the Cold War moved into its later decades, the Cambridge spy ring's influence persisted less as an active concern than as a formative reference point embedded within institutional memory, shaping how intelligence services conceptualized vulnerability and resilience in an environment defined by long-term ideological confrontation. And within MI6, this legacy manifested in a more formalized professional culture that emphasized documented procedures, compartmentation, and continuous review over informal trust networks, reflecting an implicit acknowledgement that the service's greatest failures had not arisen from technical inferiority, but from cultural blind spots that allowed loyalty to be assumed rather than demonstrated. And this shift influenced recruitment and training, as greater attention was paid to psychological assessment, ideological history, and the potential for long-term deception, an emphasis that marked a departure from earlier assumptions that social background and demeanor provided reliable indicators of allegiance. And although these reforms improved structural security, they also introduced a more cautious and bureaucratic operational environment that some practitioners believed constrained initiative, illustrating how the consequences of espionage often involve trade-offs between security and flexibility that cannot be fully resolved. And among allied intelligence services, the Cambridge case reinforced a shared understanding that penetration risk was inherent even within trusted partnerships, encouraging the development of parallel analytic capabilities and independent verification mechanisms designed to reduce reliance on any single channel, a development that increased overall resilience at the cost of efficiency, particularly during periods of crisis when rapid information sharing was essential. And this recalibration of alliance intelligence dynamics reflected a broader maturation of the Cold War system, in which the expectation of absolute trust gave way to managed cooperation grounded in mutual skepticism. And from a strategic perspective, the ring's legacy also influenced how Western policymakers interpreted intelligence assessments, fostering a greater awareness of uncertainty and a reluctance to treat intelligence conclusions as definitive guides to action, an awareness that aligned with the logic of deterrence and crisis stability, where misinterpretation could have catastrophic consequences. And in this sense, the damage inflicted by the Cambridge spies paradoxically contributed to a more restrained decision-making culture, by exposing the dangers of overconfidence in intelligence-derived certainty. And for historians, this outcome complicates moral narratives of betrayal and loyalty, because while the ring undeniably caused harm by undermining operations and distorting analysis, its exposure and aftermath also forced adaptations that strengthened institutional robustness over time, a dynamic that underscores the non-linear relationship between intelligence failure and institutional learning. And as archival evidence has accumulated, it has become possible to trace how specific early Cold War decisions were shaped by information filtered through compromised channels. Yet, it has also become clear that the broader trajectory of the Cold War was influenced by a multitude of factors that extended beyond intelligence alone, making the ring's impact significant but not determinative. And this balanced assessment reflects the methodological challenge of intelligence history, where causation must be inferred from incomplete records and where the absence of evidence can be as consequential as its presence. And in evaluating the Cambridge spy ring's Cold War legacy, it is therefore necessary to situate it within this wider context, recognizing that its greatest significance lay not in altering the balance of power directly, but in revealing the vulnerabilities of elite institutions operating under conditions of ideological conflict, vulnerabilities that could be exploited patiently and invisibly over time. And as the Cold War drew toward its conclusion, the Ring story remained relevant as a cautionary tale for intelligence services confronting new forms of penetration and influence, reminding them that the most effective adversaries are often those who align themselves seamlessly with institutional norms while pursuing objectives that remain hidden until exposure is unavoidable. And this lesson has retained relevance beyond the specific historical moment of the Cold War, informing contemporary debates over insider threat, ideological radicalization, and the limits of procedural security in complex organizations. And in this final analytical frame, the Cambridge spy ring can be understood as both a product of its era and a timeless illustration of the challenges inherent in intelligence work, where secrecy, trust, and interpretation intersect in ways that defy simple solutions, and where the consequences of failure are measured not only in lost operations, but in altered assumptions that shape behavior long after the original breach has been closed, leaving a legacy that continues to inform how intelligence services understand themselves and the adversaries they seek to know. In closing, the Cambridge spy ring stands as one of the most consequential intelligence penetrations of the Cold War, not because it produced a single decisive revelation or precipitated an immediate strategic reversal, but because it operated silently at the level where intelligence systems form their assumptions, evaluate their own reliability, and decide how much confidence to place in what they believe they know. And by embedding trusted agents within the institutions responsible for interpreting Soviet behavior, the ring distorted Western understanding during a formative period when threat perceptions, alliance structures, and intelligence methodologies were still fluid, ensuring that uncertainty was not merely an external condition imposed by an opaque adversary, but an internally generated feature of Western intelligence itself. And this internalization of uncertainty shaped the Cold War's intelligence environment in ways that extended far beyond Britain, influencing American confidence in human intelligence, altering patterns of intelligence sharing within NATO, and reinforcing a gradual shift toward technical collection methods that promised objectivity but often sacrificed insight into intention. And while these adaptations improved resilience against certain forms of penetration, they also narrowed the analytic lens through which policymakers viewed the Soviet Union, contributing to a strategic culture that emphasized measurable capabilities over political dynamics, a culture whose origins can be traced in part to the damage inflicted by ideologically motivated insiders who had exploited assumptions of loyalty rooted in class, background, and shared experience. And as the Cold War progressed, the memory of the Cambridge spy ring became institutionalized as a warning rather than a scandal, shaping doctrine, training, and counterintelligence priorities without requiring constant reference to the individuals involved. A transformation that illustrates how intelligence failures are often absorbed not through dramatic reform, but through gradual changes in professional norms. And for historians, the ring's significance lies in how it illuminates the intersection of ideology and institution, showing how deeply held beliefs about social identity and trust can become strategic liabilities when confronted by adversaries willing to operate on longer timelines and with greater patience than defensive systems are designed to anticipate. And this insight complicates any simplistic narrative of espionage as a contest of cleverness alone, revealing it instead as a struggle over organizational self-understanding and the assumptions that govern access, credibility, and doubt. And in the broader Cold War context, the Cambridge spy ring thus serves as a reminder that intelligence rivalry was not fought solely across borders or through technology, but within institutions themselves, where the most damaging compromises could occur without triggering alarms precisely because they aligned with prevailing expectations. And as the Cold War ended and intelligence services turned toward new threats, the lessons drawn from this episode retained relevance, informing debates over insider risk, ideological motivation, and the limits of procedural security in environments where trust remains indispensable yet inherently vulnerable. And in this final assessment, the Cambridge spy ring's Cold War legacy is defined less by the secrets it delivered to Moscow than by the enduring transformation it forced upon Western intelligence culture, a transformation born of betrayal, but sustained by reflection, shaping how intelligence services learn to live with uncertainty in a divided world where absolute certainty was neither achievable nor safe to assume.